The road was dark that October evening in 1620, and the mist clung to the hedgerows like something alive. Anne Griffith walked slowly, her cloak drawn tight against the Yorkshire cold, her sisters somewhere ahead on the narrow lane leading back to Burton Agnes Hall. She had lingered too long in the village, admiring the stonework of a new manor house being built, speaking of architecture and beauty with a kind of passion that made her forget the fading light. The trees pressed close on either side. The wind carried no sound but the rustle of dead leaves. Then came the footsteps behind her, heavy, deliberate. She turned, and in the failing dusk saw the shapes of men emerging from the wood. Their faces were shadowed. Their hands held iron and wood. She opened her mouth to call out, but the first blow came swift and terrible, and the world tilted sideways into blood and darkness. The men took nothing of value. They left her crumpled in the mud, her breath shallow, her skull fractured beneath her dark hair. When her sisters found her minutes later, she was still alive. Barely. They carried her home through the gathering night, and Anne Griffith, who had loved that house more than anything in the world, whispered a single request before the fever took her. What she asked would haunt Burton Agnes Hall for centuries. Chapter 1. The House of Stone and Dream. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night has drawn its curtain across the world, and wherever you find yourself in this quiet hour, whether nestled beneath blankets in a darkened room or watching the last embers fade in a distant hearth, you are welcome here. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? What hour marks your clock as you settle into stillness? Before we begin our descent into Yorkshire's shadowed past, I ask only this. If these whispered histories bring you comfort in the dark hours, subscribe to this channel, share these tales with those who seek rest in the company of ghosts. Your support breathes life into forgotten voices, and for that I am grateful. Tonight, we travel to a manor house in the East Riding, where stone walls hold a secret, and where one woman's love for her home became a bond that death itself could not sever. Let us drift backward now, to the year 1598, when Burton Agnes Hall first rose from Yorkshire earth, and a young woman named Anne Griffith looked upon it and saw eternity. The foundation stones were laid in the spring when the hawthorn bloomed white along the hedgerows, and the ploughed fields stretched dark and rich beneath the uncertain skies. Sir Henry Griffith had commissioned the house, a man of means and Norman blood whose family had held lands in Yorkshire since the Conquest. The old manor had served well enough for generations, but Sir Henry possessed the ambition common to men of his station in that age of Elizabeth, when England prospered and the great houses of the realm competed in splendour and permanence. He wanted something that would outlast his name. He wanted stone that would stand 1,000 years. The architect came from London, bringing with him drawings and measurements, speaking of proportion and symmetry in the Italian manner that had become fashionable among the northern gentry. The masons came from York and Beverley, their hands scarred from chisel work, their eyes measuring angles with an accuracy born of decades at the trade. Anne Griffith was 15 years old when the first stones were set. She was the youngest of 3 daughters, quieter than her sisters Frances and Margaret, more given to contemplation than to the social pleasures that occupied young women of gentle birth. While her sisters practised their needlework in the solar of the old house, or walked the gardens discussing suitors and court gossip, Anne would slip away to watch the builders at their labour. She stood in the mud and observed the way they mixed the mortar, the careful placement of each dressed stone, the mathematics of archway and buttress. The master mason, a grey-bearded man named Thomas Ventris, tolerated her presence with gruff amusement at first, then with something approaching respect when he realised the girl was not merely wandering in idle curiosity. She asked questions. She wanted to understand how weight was distributed, how the walls would bear the roof, why certain stones were cut at particular angles. Ventris would pause in his work, wipe the dust from his hands, and explain these mysteries to her with the patience of a craftsman who recognises genuine interest. The house took shape slowly, as all great works do. Year followed year, and Anne grew from girl to young woman while Burton Agnes Hall rose around her family's daily life. The ground floor emerged first, with its great hall and parlours, its kitchens and service rooms built into the earth itself. Then came the staterooms on the first floor, chambers designed for entertaining guests of rank, their windows tall and filled with glass that cost more than a farmer earned in 5 seasons. The plasterwork was ordered from Italian craftsmen, men who could make flat surfaces bloom with flowers and fruits, with gods and goddesses from classical antiquity, with geometrical patterns that seemed to shift and dance in candlelight. The oak came from local forests, massive beams that required teams of oxen to transport, timbers that would frame the roof and floors and staircases. Anne watched it all. She memorized the layout of every room before the walls were fully raised. She knew where each window would sit, which chambers would catch the morning sun, how the light would move through the house as the day progressed. Her father indulged this peculiar fascination, though he understood it perfectly. Sir Henry was not an unkind man, merely a practical one, and he saw no harm in his youngest daughter's interest in architecture, so long as it did not interfere with the more important business of finding her a suitable husband. Anne was not beautiful in the conventional manner. Her face was long and serious, her eyes dark and observant rather than sparkling with flirtation. She spoke little at table when guests visited, though she listened carefully to everything said. She had no talent for music, and her needlework was adequate but uninspired. What she possessed was an intensity of focus that could be unsettling to those who did not know her well. When Anne fixed her attention on something, she gave herself to it completely. And she had fixed her attention on Burton Agnes Hall with the devotion of a nun consecrating herself to God. By 1610, when Anne was 27 years old and long past the age when most women of her class had married, the house was substantially complete. The exterior stood finished and magnificent, its red brick and white stone glowing warm in summer light, its many windows reflecting clouds and sky. The great hall stretched 60 feet in length, its hammer-beam roof a marvel of engineering and craft. The parlours were panelled in oak so dark it seemed almost black, carved with acanthus leaves and pomegranates, with Tudor roses and the Griffith family arms. The long gallery ran the length of the second floor, a space for exercise in winter and for the display of portraits, though these had not yet been commissioned. Anne walked through the completed rooms with something close to reverence. She touched the walls as one might touch the face of a beloved. She stood at the windows and looked out at the Yorkshire countryside, the fields and villages spreading away toward the distant moors, and felt that she was seeing the view not merely with her own eyes, but with the eyes of all who would stand in this place for centuries to come. Her sisters had married by then. Frances had gone to a landed family in Lincolnshire, Margaret to a merchant's son in Hull whose wealth compensated for his lack of ancient lineage. Both had urged Anne to accept one of the several proposals she had received over the years, decent offers from younger sons and minor gentry, men who would have provided comfortable establishments, if not brilliant matches. Anne had refused them all with polite firmness. She gave no explanation that satisfied anyone. The truth, which she kept to herself, was that she could not imagine leaving Burton Agnes Hall. The house had become inseparable from her sense of self. To leave it would be like tearing away part of her own flesh. Her father, growing old and increasingly concerned about his youngest daughter's future, had largely given up pressing the matter. Anne would remain unmarried. She would live out her days at Burton Agnes, managing the household after her father's death, growing into one of those spinster gentlewomen who became fixtures of their family estates, neither wife nor widow, but something apart. She did not mind the prospect, while her sisters wrote letters describing their children and their husbands' affairs, their social obligations and domestic concerns. Anne walked the corridors of Burton Agnes Hall and felt a contentment that she suspected few married women ever knew. She had her books, a small collection of devotional works and histories that she read by the light of tallow candles in her chamber. She had her correspondence with a handful of educated women, daughters of clergy and scholars, who shared her interest in architecture and natural philosophy, and she had the house itself which she tended with meticulous care. She knew when timbers needed treatment against rot, when stonework required repointing, which chimneys drew poorly in certain winds. The servants learned to come to her rather than to the ageing Sir Henry when questions arose about household management. Anne kept accounts with precision. She dealt fairly with tradesmen and tenants. She earned respect, if not affection, for there was something in her manner that discouraged intimacy. She held herself apart as if reserving her deepest feelings for the stone and timber that surrounded her. The years between 1610 and 1620 passed quietly. Sir Henry died in 1617, leaving Burton Agnes Hall to his eldest daughter Frances, though the terms of his will granted Anne the right to remain in residence for the duration of her life. Frances, secure in her Lincolnshire manor and occupied with her own family, was content with this arrangement. She visited occasionally but left the actual management to Anne, who by then was mistress of Burton Agnes in all but name. The house aged gracefully through those years, its stone darkening slightly with weather, its gardens maturing into the planned designs, its rooms accumulating the patina of habitation. Anne was 47 years old in the autumn of 1620. Her hair had begun to grey at the temples. Her hands showed the first signs of age, the skin growing thinner, the joints occasionally stiff in cold weather. She had long since accepted that she would die unmarried and childless. The thought did not distress her. She had Burton Agnes Hall, and that was sufficient. On the 15th of October in that year, Anne walked to the nearby village of Harpham, a journey of some 3 miles along country lanes that she had travelled countless times before. A new manor house was being built there by a family recently risen to wealth through wool trading, and Anne had been invited to view the construction. She went eagerly, bringing with her a small leather-bound notebook in which she recorded architectural observations, sketches of mouldings and window designs that interested her. The afternoon was pleasant, the autumn sun warm enough to make the walk comfortable, the leaves just beginning to turn gold and russet on the trees. She spent several hours at the building site, speaking with the master carpenter about roof construction, examining the foundation work, admiring the quality of the stone that had been quarried locally. When she finally took her leave, thanking her hosts for their hospitality, the sun had dropped low toward the horizon and the air had grown cold. She walked alone. This was not unusual. Anne had never felt the need for a servant to accompany her on short journeys, and the roads around Burton Agnes were considered safe enough. Crime existed, certainly. Footpads and vagrants, poachers and thieves. But violent robbery was rare in this settled agricultural country. Anne wrapped her dark cloak around her shoulders and set off at a steady pace, her mind still occupied with thoughts of timber spans and stone facings. The lane narrowed as it passed through a stretch of woodland, old oaks pressing close on either side, their branches forming a tunnel overhead. The light faded quickly beneath the trees. Anne quickened her steps slightly, not from fear, but from a practical desire to reach home before full darkness fell. She was thinking of Burton Agnes Hall, picturing the candlelight that would be showing in the windows, the fire that would be burning in the great hall, the supper that would be waiting. She was thinking of home. She didn't hear the men behind her until it was too late. Chapter 2. The Road in Twilight. The first blow came from behind, a cudgel or staff striking her between the shoulder blades with force enough to drive the breath from her lungs and send her stumbling forward onto her knees. The notebook fell from her hands into the mud. She tried to cry out, but the air would not come. She heard footsteps, multiple sets, moving around her in the darkness. Rough hands seized her cloak, dragging her sideways off the path. She twisted, trying to see their faces, but the twilight had thickened into near darkness beneath the trees, and the men were only shapes, darker patches of shadow against shadow. One of them struck her again, this time across the side of her head. The world tilted. Pain exploded behind her eyes, bright and terrible. She felt herself falling, felt the cold mud against her cheek, tasted blood in her mouth. The men were speaking, but their voices seemed to come from a great distance, words without meaning, sounds that belonged to some other world than the one she was rapidly leaving. They searched her. Hands rifled through the folds of her cloak, found the small purse she carried at her waist, took it. The purse contained perhaps 3 shillings, a few pence, nothing of real value. One of the men swore. She heard that clearly enough, a Yorkshire accent, though whether from this parish or another she could not tell. Another voice, younger, higher pitched, asking what they should do now. A third voice, rougher, older, telling them to finish it and go. She understood then, with the clarity that sometimes comes in moments of extremity, that they had expected her to be someone else. They had been waiting on this road for a traveller of means, someone worth robbing, and had instead found a spinster woman in a plain cloak with almost nothing worth stealing. And now they had a choice to make. They could leave her here, injured but alive, able to identify them if she survived, or they could ensure her silence. The decision was made quickly. She felt rather than saw the man standing over her, felt the weight of intention in the air. She tried to speak, to tell them that she would say nothing, that she had seen nothing, that they could go in peace, but her mouth would not form words. Blood ran into her left eye. The pain in her head had become something absolute, a red agony that filled the entire world. The second blow to her skull came with a sound like wood splitting, a crack that she heard from inside her own bones. After that, there was only darkness and the sensation of falling through empty space, falling and falling while somewhere far above the trees whispered to one another, and the first stars emerged in a sky she could no longer see. How long she lay there in the mud, the men gone into the night with their miserable handful of coins, could not afterward be determined. It might have been minutes. It might have been an hour. Time had ceased to have meaning. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes aware of the cold seeping through her clothes, sometimes lost in fevered dreams where she walked through Burton Agnes Hall and found all the rooms changed, the walls transparent as glass, the roof open to a sky that pressed down like water. Once she thought she heard voices calling her name. But when she tried to respond, darkness claimed her again. The pain in her head had become a living thing, pulsing with her heartbeat, spreading tendrils of agony down her neck and spine. She could not move her left arm. Her right hand clawed at the mud trying to find purchase, trying to pull herself upward, but her body would not obey. She felt herself slipping away, felt the edges of her consciousness fraying like old cloth, and in that moment of dissolution, her last coherent thought was of Burton Agnes Hall. Not of God or salvation, not of her sisters or her dead parents, but of the house she would never see again. It was Francis who found her. Francis and Margaret, who had come to Burton Agnes for a visit and finding Anne not yet returned from Harpham as darkness fell, had grown concerned enough to send servants along the road with lanterns. They found her 50 yards past the wooded section, where she had managed somehow to crawl or drag herself partway toward home before collapsing again on the verge. Frances screamed when the lantern light fell across her sister's face. Margaret, more practical, knelt in the mud and felt for a pulse at Anne's throat, found it weak and rapid, called for the men to bring a door from the nearest cottage to use as a stretcher. They lifted Anne carefully, though by then she was beyond knowing care from roughness. Her eyes were closed. Blood matted her hair and had soaked into the collar of her dress. Her breathing came in shallow gasps. Frances rode ahead to Burton Agnes, shouting for hot water and clean linen, for the surgeon to be summoned from Bridlington, though in her heart she knew it was likely too late. Margaret walked beside the makeshift stretcher, holding her sister's cold hand, speaking to her in low tones, though Anne gave no sign of hearing. They brought her home to Burton Agnes Hall near midnight. The servants had prepared her chamber, building up the fire until the room was stifling. laying clean sheets on the bed, setting basins of water on the side table. They undressed her carefully, cutting away the ruined clothes, washing the blood from her face and hair as gently as they could. The wound was terrible. The left side of her skull had been fractured, the bone cracked and depressed, fragments driven inward. Blood and clear fluid seeped from the injury despite all efforts to staunch it. Her left eye was swollen shut, the surrounding tissue already turning purple and black. When the surgeon arrived in the small hours of the morning, he examined her briefly, then drew Francis and Margaret aside and told them what they already knew. There was nothing to be done. The injury was mortal. It was only a matter of time, and likely not much time at that. He could bleed her, he said, to ease the pressure on the brain. He could apply poultices. But these were gestures only. Comfort for the living rather than aid for the dying. Francis sent him away with payment for his journey and returned to her sister's bedside. Anne did not die quickly. The human body possesses reserves of strength that can prolong life, even when death is certain, and Anne's constitution, hardened by years of active management of a large household, proved stubborn in its refusal to surrender. She lingered through the night and into the next day, sometimes unconscious, sometimes rising toward awareness in moments of fever-bright lucidity. During these moments she would speak, though often her words made little sense. She spoke of the house, always of the house. She described rooms that did not exist, staircases that led nowhere, windows that looked out onto vistas from childhood or dream. Once she called for her father, who had been dead 3 years. Once she recited a prayer in Latin, though where she had learned it no one knew. The fever climbed. By evening of the second day her skin burned to the touch, and her pulse raced so fast it could barely be counted. The surgeon returned and shook his head. Before morning, he said, perhaps before midnight. But Anne held on. Through that second night she held on, while Francis and Margaret took turns sitting beside her, bathing her forehead with cool water, speaking to her of nothing and everything, filling the silence with the sound of the living voices so she would not feel alone. The candles burned down and were replaced. The fire was fed. Outside, rain began to fall, pattering against the windows, running down the glass in streams that caught the firelight and threw wavering shadows across the walls. Anne's breathing grew more laboured. She began to mutter, words tumbling from her cracked lips in a constant stream, sometimes audible, more often not. Francis leaned close, trying to catch the meaning, and heard her sister speaking of Burton Agnes Hall, describing it room by room, as if she were walking through it, as if she were conducting a tour for some invisible companion. The great hall with its carved screens, the parlour with its Italian plasterwork. The long gallery where light fell in golden bars across the polished floor. On and on, a litany of love, an inventory of everything she held dear. Near dawn on the third day, Anne's eyes opened. The fever had burned away whatever clouded her vision, and for a moment she was fully present, fully herself, looking up at her sisters with recognition and clarity. Francis gripped her hand. Margaret leaned forward. They had both been crying, their faces drawn with exhaustion and grief, but they tried to smile for her. Anne's lips moved. They bent closer to hear. Her voice was barely a whisper, dry and cracked, but the words were distinct. She wanted to be brought home, she said. When she died, she wanted to be brought home to Burton Agnes Hall, not buried in the churchyard at Harpham with their parents, not laid in the family vault with ancestors she had never known, but here, in the house she loved. She wanted to remain. Francis tried to soothe her, promising that of course they would honour her wishes, that she would rest wherever she desired. But Anne's grip tightened on her sister's hand with surprising strength. She repeated it. Home. Burton Agnes. Promise. Her eyes were urgent, almost desperate, as if she could see something they could not, as if she knew something about what came after, that they had not yet learned. Francis promised. Margaret promised. They would find a way. though both knew that burial within a private home was irregular at best, and possibly forbidden by church law. But they promised because Anne was dying and because they loved her, and because sometimes the dying must be given whatever comfort words can provide, whether those words can be kept or not. Anne seemed to relax then. Her grip loosened, her eyes closed. Her breathing, which had been so laboured, seemed to ease slightly. She slipped back into unconsciousness, but this time it was different, deeper, a gradual sinking rather than the fever-tossed delirium of the previous days. The rain continued outside. The candles burned. The sisters sat and waited, as women have sat and waited beside the dying since the world began, helpless and faithful, witnesses to a mystery they could not prevent or understand. Anne Griffith died as the sun rose on October 18th, 1620. There was no drama in it, no final words or gestures. She simply stopped breathing. One moment the faint rise and fall of her chest continued, and the next moment it ceased. Frances, who was holding her hand, felt the last pulse fade beneath her fingers. Margaret closed Anne's eyes. They sat for a while longer in silence, not yet ready to acknowledge what had happened, not yet willing to leave her alone. The room was very still. The fire had burned down to embers. Through the window the rain-washed morning showed grey and soft, the gardens of Burton Agnes Hall emerging from darkness, the stone walls of the house gleaming wet in the early light. Somewhere below a servant was stirring, beginning the day's work, unaware yet that the mistress of the house had departed. Anne lay on the bed, her face finally peaceful, the pain and fever gone, her hands folded across her breast. She looked smaller in death, as the dead often do, as if mortality itself diminishes the physical frame. But her face, despite the bruising and the terrible wound, held a kind of serenity. She had come home. She had died in Burton Agnes Hall, and now her sisters would have to decide what to do with the promise they had made. Jutsos Chapter 3. The Dying Wish. The household went into mourning. Black cloth was draped across the mirrors and pictures. The clocks were stopped at the hour of Anne's death. The servants wore black armbands and spoke in hushed tones as they went about their duties. Word was sent to the parish church at Harpham, to the rector who would conduct the funeral service, to relatives and acquaintances who needed to be informed. Frances and Margaret, exhausted from their vigil, slept briefly, and then rose to face the necessary arrangements. The body had to be prepared for burial. The grave had to be readied. Food and drink had to be organised for the mourners who would gather. Death, even expected death, brings with it a weight of practical obligations that must be met regardless of grief. The first difficulty arose almost immediately. When Frances approached the rector, Reverend Thomas Mallory, about Anne's request to be buried at Burton Agnes Hall, he refused outright. It was not done, he said firmly. Christian burial took place in consecrated ground, in the churchyard, under the authority and blessing of the church. Private burial on estate grounds was a practice of the old religion, of Catholics and recusants, who refused to accept the authority of the established church. The Griffith family, he reminded her, had always been sound in their faith, loyal to the crown and to the Church of England. To bury Anne anywhere but in the family vault at Harpham would invite scandal and suspicion. It would suggest papist sympathies. It could bring the attention of the bishop, perhaps even of the magistrates. He would not permit it. Frances, too tired to argue, simply nodded and withdrew. She discussed the matter with Margaret in the parlour of Burton Agnes Hall, speaking quietly so the servants would not hear. Margaret was inclined to accept the rector's judgment. Anne had been feverish when she made the request, not in her right mind, and surely she would have understood the impossibility of what she asked if she had been thinking clearly. They should proceed with a proper burial at Harpham and honour their sister's memory in other ways, perhaps a memorial stone or a charitable bequest in her name. Frances was less certain. She remembered the urgency in Anne's eyes, the strength with which she had gripped her hand, the way she had demanded a promise. It had not seemed like fever talk. It had seemed like something else, something deeper. But what could they do? They could hardly defy the rector and the church. They could not simply inter Anne's body in the gardens or cellars of Burton Agnes and pretend it had not happened. The law would not permit it. Society would not permit it. They would have to break their promise, and perhaps Anne, wherever she was now, would understand and forgive. The wake was held in the great hall. Anne's body, washed and dressed in a simple gown of dark wool, lay in an open coffin set upon trestles. Candles burned at head and foot. Mourners came throughout the day, tenants and servants, neighbours and distant relatives, people who had known Anne slightly or not at all, but who came because custom required it. They filed past the coffin, murmured prayers, offered condolences to Francis and Margaret. Some remarked on the brutality of the injury, the violence that had been done. Others spoke of the uncertainty of life, of the dangers that lurked even on familiar roads. The women of the parish brought food, pies and bread and cold meats, ale and beer. By evening the hall was crowded, and the air was thick with the smell of candle wax and wet wool, and too many bodies in an enclosed space. Frances stood near the coffin and accepted sympathies with mechanical courtesy, her face composed, her words appropriate, while inside she felt nothing but a vast emptiness. Anne was gone. The house felt different already, as if some essential spirit had departed with her. The funeral was set for 2 days hence, time enough for relatives from more distant parts to arrive if they wished. The coffin would remain open until then, watched over by servants who would sit with the body day and night according to ancient custom. Francis and Margaret retired to their chambers, needing rest before the ordeal of the burial. The house settled into the peculiar quiet that descends upon a dwelling where death has occurred, a hush broken only by the occasional creak of floorboards or the soft voices of the watchers in the great hall. Outside, the wind had risen, driving rain against the windows, howling in the chimneys. Autumn was deepening toward winter. The trees had lost most of their leaves. The fields lay bare and dark under heavy clouds. On the second night of the wake, something happened. The servant keeping watch in the great hall, a woman named Mary Sutton, who had served the Griffith family for 20 years, sat in her chair beside the coffin with her sewing in her lap. The fire burned low, the candles guttered in a draught. The hour was late, past midnight, approaching that dead time before dawn when the body's vitality sinks lowest and sleep presses hardest upon the eyelids. Mary was drowsing, her head nodding forward, the sewing forgotten. Then she heard a sound, a soft thump, as if something had fallen in another room. She lifted her head, listening. The sound came again, louder. A crash, like crockery breaking, then another crash, and another, a whole cascading series of impacts that seemed to move through the house, coming closer. Mary stood, her heart suddenly racing. The noises were coming from the parlour, the chamber directly adjacent to the great hall. She moved to the doorway and looked out into the passage. The corridor was dark, lit only by the faint glow of her single candle. She called out, asking if someone was there. No answer. The crashing had stopped. Silence pressed in, thick and expectant. She took a few steps into the passage, holding her candle high. The parlour door stood open. She approached it slowly, though every instinct screamed at her to turn back. She reached the doorway and looked in. The room was chaos. Every piece of crockery that had been set on the shelves, every plate and cup and bowl, lay shattered on the floor. The furniture had been overturned. Pictures hung askew on the walls. It looked as if a violent struggle had taken place, as if some tremendous force had swept through and destroyed everything in its path. But the window was closed. The door had been shut until she opened it. No one could have entered or left. Mary backed away, the candle trembling in her hand. She returned to the great hall and stood beside Anne's coffin, staring down at the pale, peaceful face, and felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the October night. She said nothing until morning. When Frances and Margaret came down at dawn, she told them what had happened. They went to the parlour and saw the destruction for themselves. Margaret suggested that perhaps something had fallen, started a chain reaction, caused the shelves to collapse. But Frances walked through the room, examining the damage, and shook her head. The shelves were intact. The crockery had not fallen. It had been thrown, scattered with force across the floor. The furniture had been deliberately overturned, and yet no one had been in the room. The door had been locked from the outside. Frances said nothing, but her face was troubled. She ordered the servants to clean up the mess and said no more about it. But that night, when she lay in bed, she found herself thinking of Anne's dying wish, of the promise that had been made and broken, and she wondered if perhaps the dead did not always rest as easily as the living assumed. The funeral took place the following day. The coffin was closed and loaded onto a cart for the journey to Harpham Church. Frances and Margaret rode behind in a carriage, dressed in black, their faces veiled. Other mourners followed on foot or horseback. The procession moved slowly along the muddy roads, rain falling steadily, the grey sky pressing low. At Harpham Church, Reverend Mallory conducted the service with proper solemnity, reading the prayers for the dead, committing Anne's soul to God's mercy and her body to the earth from which it came. The coffin was carried down into the family vault beneath the church floor, that dark stone chamber where generations of Griffiths lay in their lead-lined coffins, slowly returning to dust. Anne's coffin was placed on a stone shelf beside her parents'. The vault was sealed. The mourners departed. Frances and Margaret returned to Burton Agnes Hall in silence, having done their duty, having honoured their sister with a Christian burial in consecrated ground. The promise made to a dying woman had been broken, but it had been broken for good reason, for proper reason, and surely that would be the end of it. That night, the screaming began. Chapter 4. The Burial at Harpham. The sound came first to the servants who slept in the attic chambers, a high, wailing cry that pierced through wood and plaster, through the depths of exhausted sleep, jolting them awake with hammering hearts. Mary Sutton sat up in her narrow bed, disoriented, trying to place the source. The cry came again, rising and falling, unmistakably human, unmistakably female, a sound of such anguish that it seemed to contain all the grief and rage and desperation that flesh could bear. She fumbled for her candle, lit it with shaking hands, and crept to her door. Other servants were emerging from their rooms, pale-faced, whispering to one another. Was it Frances? Had she been taken ill? Was Margaret hurt? They moved together toward the main staircase, a small cluster of frightened people in nightclothes, carrying their feeble lights before them like shields. The screaming continued. As they descended the stairs, they realized it was coming from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the corridors, seeming to originate from within the walls themselves. It would rise to a pitch of unbearable intensity, then fall to a sobbing moan, then rise again. There were no words in it, only raw emotion, only pain. They found Frances and Margaret already in the great hall, standing in their nightgowns, their own candles held high, their faces showing the same fear the servants felt. Frances demanded to know who was making that sound. The servants could only shake their heads. They had thought it was her. The screaming rose again, so loud now that some of the servants clapped their hands over their ears. It seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the sound. They stood motionless, listening, waiting for it to resume. Minutes passed. Nothing. Finally, Margaret suggested that perhaps it had been an animal, a vixen in heat, which could sound eerily human in the night. But even as she said it, she did not believe it. No animal made a sound like that. Frances ordered the servants back to bed, though she knew none of them would sleep. She and Margaret searched the house room by room, looking for any natural explanation, any source for the terrible noise. They found nothing. The house was still. The windows were closed. The doors were barred. When they finally returned to their own chambers near dawn, exhausted and unnerved, they lay awake listening to the silence and trying to convince themselves that it would not happen again. It happened again the next night, and the night after that. The screaming came at different hours, sometimes near midnight, sometimes in the small hours before dawn. It lasted anywhere from a few minutes to nearly an hour. Always it had that same quality of desperate anguish, of someone in unendurable torment. The servants began to speak of leaving. Burton Agnes Hall, they whispered, was haunted. Something unholy had taken up residence. Frances tried to maintain order, insisting that there must be a rational explanation, that they would discover the source and put an end to it. But even as she spoke, she felt the authority draining from her words. She knew what the servants knew. She had heard the screaming herself. It was not natural. It was not of this world. On the fourth night, the disturbances expanded. The screaming was accompanied now by other sounds, doors slamming throughout the house, heavy footsteps in empty corridors, the crash of objects being thrown. When they investigated in the morning, they found more destruction. Furniture overturned in rooms that had been locked, pictures torn from walls. In the long gallery, every window had been opened, though they had all been secure the night before. The cold October wind had blown through all night, scattering papers and extinguishing fires, filling the house with a chill that seemed to penetrate bone. Frances and Margaret stood in the gallery looking at the damage, and Frances finally spoke the thought that had been growing in her mind since the first night. It was Anne. Somehow, it was Anne. They went together to Harpham Church. Reverend Mallory received them in his study, a small book-lined room that smelled of old paper and candle smoke. Frances told him everything: the dying wish, the broken promise, the screaming, the disturbances. Mallory listened with growing discomfort. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said what she had expected him to say. It was impossible. The dead did not walk. The dead did not scream or overturn furniture or open windows. What they were experiencing was either the product of overwrought nerves and grief-induced imagination, or it was the work of living persons playing cruel tricks. Perhaps servants with a grievance. Perhaps village folk with superstitious malice. He suggested they investigate more thoroughly, perhaps bring in the local magistrate to question the household. He would not accept that Anne Griffith's spirit was abroad and angry, but Frances had seen too much now to be dismissed. She pressed him. What if the dead could return? What if they could make their displeasure known? The Bible spoke of such things: the Witch of Endor summoning Samuel's spirit, the souls of the martyrs crying out from beneath the altar in Revelation. The Church taught that the soul departed to await judgment. But what if, in certain circumstances, a soul refused to depart? What if it clung to the place it loved, held there by unfinished business or unsatisfied longing? Mallory grew uncomfortable. These were deep theological waters, questions that had no clear answers. He admitted reluctantly that there were cases in the histories of the Church, accounts that were difficult to explain away, saints who had appeared after death, spirits who had returned to right wrongs or reveal hidden truths. But these were exceptional cases, and they involved holy persons, not ordinary gentlewomen who had died by violence. Frances asked him plainly, what would satisfy a restless spirit? Mallory hesitated. In the old days, he said slowly, before the Reformation, the Church had taught that masses could be said for the dead, prayers offered to ease their passage through purgatory. But that was Catholic doctrine, superstition that the Reformed faith had rightly abandoned. The dead were beyond the reach of human prayers. Their fate was sealed at the moment of death. And yet, he paused, seeming to struggle with something. There were other traditions. Folk beliefs that even educated men sometimes half-credited in private. That the dead must be given what they desired. That promises made to the dying must be kept. Or the spirit would find no rest. He was not saying he believed such things, he emphasized. But if one hypothetically accepted that Anne's spirit was disturbed, then hypothetically, giving her what she had asked for might restore peace. Frances understood. She asked directly, could Anne be reburied at Burton Agnes Hall? Mallory shook his head immediately. Absolutely not. The body was consecrated ground now, in the family vault where it must remain. To exhume and move it would be sacrilege. The bishop would never permit it. The civil authorities would intervene. It was legally impossible and spiritually questionable. Frances pressed harder. What if they did not move the entire body? What if they brought just a part back to Burton Agnes? Enough to honour the dying wish. Enough to let Anne feel that she had come home. Mallory stared at her in horror. She was suggesting desecration of a corpse, he said. Mutilation of the dead. It was forbidden by both church and common law. It was unthinkable. Frances met his gaze steadily. More unthinkable than what was happening now at Burton Agnes Hall. More forbidden than spirits screaming in the night and tearing apart a house. Mallory had no answer for that. They left him still protesting, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. He half believed her. He had heard stories himself, perhaps. Tales whispered in country parishes where the old belief still held power beneath the veneer of reformed religion. Frances and Margaret returned to Burton Agnes Hall and called the servants together. She asked who among them would be willing to go to Harpham Church at night, to open the family vault, and to do what was necessary. There was long silence. Finally, two men stepped forward. John Hewitt, the head groom, and Thomas Wade, the gardener. Both were older men, loyal to the family, not easily frightened. They would do it, they said. If it would bring peace to the house and to Anne's spirit, they would do it. Frances thanked them and told them to wait for her word. That night the screaming was worse than ever. It went on for hours, rising and falling, punctuated now by crashes so violent that plaster cracked in the walls. Servants huddled together in the kitchen, praying aloud, some of them weeping. Frances and Margaret sat in the great hall and endured it, their faces pale, their hands clasped together. When dawn finally came and silence returned, Frances rose and went to find John Hewitt. Tonight, she told him. They would go tonight. Bring tools, a pry bar, a lantern, whatever was needed. She would go with them. Margaret protested, but Frances was firm. This was her responsibility. She had made the promise. She would see it kept. Margaret finally nodded. She would come too. They would both go. The night was moonless, thick with clouds, the darkness absolute beyond the reach of their lanterns. Frances, Margaret, John Hewitt and Thomas Wade made their way along the road to Harpham Church, speaking little, each absorbed in private thoughts. The church stood dark and silent, its stone tower black against the sky. The door was locked, but Wade had brought the key. He served as sexton as well as gardener, and knew where all the keys were kept. They entered the cold nave, their footsteps echoing on the stone floor. The vault entrance was near the altar, a heavy flagstone with an iron ring set into it. The two men lifted it, grunting with effort, and slid it aside. A smell rose from below, the smell of earth and damp and older things. Wade descended first with a lantern, then Hewitt. Frances and Margaret followed, gathering their skirts, stepping carefully down the narrow stone stairs. The vault was small and low-ceilinged, barely tall enough for a man to stand upright. Stone shelves lined the walls, each holding a lead coffin in various stages of decay. Some were centuries old, their surfaces green with verdigris. Others were newer. Anne's coffin was on the lowest shelf, still clean, still bright. They had buried her only 5 days before. Hewitt and Wade lifted it down and set it on the floor. Frances produced the pry bar. She looked at her sister. Margaret nodded. Together they worked at the lid, forcing it up, the lead bending with surprising ease. The seal broke. The lid came free. They lifted it away. Anne lay within, exactly as she'd been placed, dressed in her dark gown, her hands folded, her face peaceful. The terrible wound on her skull was hidden by her hair, which they had arranged carefully before burial. 5 days in the vault had done little to change her appearance. The cool air had preserved her. She looked as if she might wake at any moment. Frances felt tears sting her eyes. She forced them back. She had come here to do something, and it must be done. She spoke to Wade, telling him what was needed. He looked sick, but did not refuse. He had brought a saw, a small one, the kind used for carpentry. He knelt beside the coffin, and very carefully, very gently, he began to work. It took longer than they expected. Wade worked slowly, stopping frequently to wipe sweat from his face despite the cold. The others stood watching, bearing witness, unable to look away. Finally it was done. Wade wrapped the severed head in cloth that Frances had brought, tied it carefully and handed it to her. Frances took it, feeling the weight, heavier than she'd imagined, and held it against her chest. They replaced the coffin lid as best they could, though it would no longer seal properly. They returned the coffin to its shelf. They climbed the stairs back into the church, replaced the flagstone over the vault entrance, and left the way they had come. No one spoke. What they had done was beyond words, beyond law, beyond any action that civilized people performed. They walked through the darkness carrying Anne home. Chapter 5. The Skull Returns Home. They arrived at Burton Agnes Hall as the first grey light of dawn touched the eastern horizon. The house stood silent, its many windows dark, the servants not yet stirring. Frances carried the wrapped bundle close to her body, feeling through the cloth the curve of bone, the weight of her sister's remains. They entered through the kitchen door, which Wade unlocked with his key, and made their way through the service passages to the great hall. The fire died to ash. The air was cold and still. Frances set the bundle on the long oak table, unwrapped it carefully, and looked down at what they had brought. Anne's head, separated from her body, looked smaller than it had in life. The skin had taken on a waxy pallor, but the features were still recognizably hers. The long face, the serious expression, the dark hair now dull and matted with dried blood around the terrible wound. The eyes were closed. The mouth was slightly open, as if frozen in the middle of speech. Frances felt a wave of horror at what they had done, at the violation they had committed against her sister's body. But she forced herself to remain steady. They had acted out of necessity. They had kept the promise that should have been kept from the beginning. Anne had wanted to come home to Burton Agnes Hall. Now she was home. Margaret stood beside her, staring down at the severed head, her face unreadable. After a long moment she spoke quietly. Where should they put it? They could not simply leave it on the table. It needed to be somewhere fitting, somewhere respectful, somewhere Anne would have approved. Frances thought of Anne's chamber, the room where she had died. But that felt wrong somehow. Too intimate. Too much like displaying a trophy. She thought of the chapel, but Burton Agnes had no proper chapel, only a small prayer room that was rarely used. Finally she decided. The long gallery. Anne had loved the long gallery, had walked its length countless times in all seasons and weathers. They would place her there, where she could look out over the estate she had tended so carefully. They carried the head upstairs, Hewitt and Wade following behind. The long gallery stretched the entire south side of the upper floor, a space designed for exercise and display, its walls intended eventually for portraits of the family. The morning light was beginning to filter through the tall windows, pale and thin. Frances placed the head on a small table near the centre window, the one that looked out toward the gardens and the fields beyond. She arranged it carefully, almost tenderly, as if Anne could still feel discomfort or displeasure. Then she stepped back. It looked wrong, a severed head on an oak table, grotesque and unnatural. But there was nothing else to be done. They had brought Anne home. This was what she had wanted. This was what they had promised. They left the gallery and went their separate ways to wash and change clothes before the other servants woke. None of them spoke of what they had done. It was agreed without words that this would remain secret among the four of them. The household would not be told. The rector at Harpham would not be informed. What happened in the vault would stay in the vault. They would observe what followed and hope that they had done the right thing. Frances lay in her bed as full daylight arrived, exhausted but unable to sleep, listening to the house wake around her, waiting for the screaming to begin again. The hours passed. Morning became afternoon. Afternoon became evening. No screaming came. That night, Burton Agnes Hall was silent. The servants, expecting another episode of terror, huddled together in the kitchen until late, then gradually drifted to their beds when nothing happened. Frances and Margaret sat in the parlour, neither able to relax, both listening intently for any sound. Midnight came and passed. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, nothing. Only the ordinary sounds of an old house settling, timbers creaking, wind stirring the eaves. At 3, Margaret finally rose and went to bed. Frances sat alone until dawn, keeping vigil, and when the sun rose on a quiet house, she felt something inside her chest loosen slightly. Perhaps it had worked. Perhaps Anne's spirit was satisfied. Perhaps they had done what needed to be done. The days that followed were peaceful. The disturbances ceased completely. No more screaming in the night. No more doors slamming. No more objects thrown. The servants noticed and whispered among themselves, attributing the change to prayers or to the passing of time or to whatever private explanations they could construct. Frances and Margaret said nothing, but they knew. They went separately to the long gallery several times each day, checking on the head, making sure it remained undisturbed. The flesh began to deteriorate, as flesh must. The smell became noticeable after a week, even with the windows open. After 2 weeks, it was strong enough that servants commented on it, wondering what had died in the walls. Frances ordered the head moved to a closed cabinet in the gallery, a tall oak piece with doors that could be latched. Inside the darkness, the decomposition would continue unseen. Winter came early that year. By November, snow fell across Yorkshire, covering the fields in white, mounding against the walls of Burton Agnes Hall. The house grew cold despite fires in every hearth. The servants went about their work wrapped in shawls and cloaks. Frances and Margaret remained through December, reluctant to leave until they were certain the piece would hold. Anne's head, now mostly bone, stayed in its cabinet in the long gallery. Frances checked on it regularly, opening the doors to look inside, seeing the skull gradually emerging as the last of the soft tissue fell away. By Christmas, there was little left but bone and dried skin, the features that had been Anne's completely gone, leaving only the anonymous architecture of death. The wound in the skull was clearly visible now, a depression on the left side where the bone had been fractured and driven inward. Frances looked at it and thought of the men who had done this, who had murdered her sister for a few shillings. They had never been found. They had vanished into the countryside, unknown and unpunished, leaving only this violence behind. In January, Frances finally returned to her home in Lincolnshire, leaving Burton Agnes Hall in the care of hired stewards. Margaret went to Hull. Both promised to visit regularly to ensure the estate was properly managed. Neither spoke of Anne's skull or where it rested. Over the following months, the servants grew accustomed to the presence of the cabinet in the long gallery. Some of them knew or guessed what it contained, though nothing was said openly. It became simply part of the house, another piece of furniture, unremarkable except to those who knew. The skull remained there, year following year, Burton Agnes Hall's secret, Anne's final resting place, and the house was quiet. For a time. But nothing remained secret forever in a household of servants. Gossip spreads like water, finding cracks, seeping through barriers. By the spring of 1621, most of the staff knew that something strange was kept in the long gallery cabinet, something connected to the late Mistress Anne. New servants, hired to replace those who had left, heard the stories from the older staff. The tale grew in the telling, as tales do. Anne had been murdered. Her ghost had haunted the house. Her head had been brought back from the grave. It was kept upstairs in a locked cabinet. Some said it had been Francis who insisted on the arrangement. Others said it had been Anne's own dying wish, that she had demanded her head be kept at Burton Agnes after death. The versions multiplied, details changed, but the core remained constant. The house held bones. The bones had power. They must not be disturbed. Most of the servants accepted this with the practical fatalism of working people who understood that the gentry had their ways and their reasons, and it was not for servants to question. They avoided the long gallery when possible, especially at night. They did not speak of it to outsiders. Burton Agnes Hall acquired a reputation in the surrounding parishes as a house where strange things had occurred, though few knew the details. Travellers passing on the road would sometimes point it out, mentioning that it was supposed to be haunted, though by what or whom they could not say. The skull remained in its cabinet, undisturbed and undiscussed, and the years passed quietly. Then, in 1623, Frances died. She had never been robust, and a winter fever carried her off quickly. Her eldest son inherited Burton Agnes Hall, a young man named William who had visited the house only a handful of times in his life and knew little of its history. He arrived in March to take possession of his inheritance, bringing with him his wife, his young children, and a full complement of new servants from Lincolnshire. The old Yorkshire servants were dismissed or relegated to lower positions. William intended to make Burton Agnes a proper gentleman's residence, a place fit for entertaining and for raising his family in appropriate style. He walked through the house making lists of improvements, noting what needed to be updated or replaced. When he entered the long gallery and saw the old oak cabinet locked and dusty, he ordered it opened. The servant with the keys hesitated, tried to explain that the cabinet was not to be disturbed, that it contained something belonging to the former mistress. William dismissed this as superstitious nonsense and insisted. The cabinet was opened. The skull lay on the lower shelf, resting on what remained of the cloth it had been wrapped in more than 2 years before. The bone was yellowed with age, the jaw partially detached, a few strands of dark hair still clinging to the cranium. The wound was a dark hollow in the side. William stared at it for a moment, then demanded an explanation. The old steward, one of the few Yorkshire servants who remained, told him the story as he knew it. Anne Griffith, murdered on the road, dying in the house, requesting that she be kept at Burton Agnes, her head brought back when the body was buried elsewhere. William listened with growing disbelief and disgust. This was barbarism, he said. This was medieval superstition, the kind of thing that enlightened men had moved beyond. His aunt might have been murdered, tragic as that was, but keeping her severed head in a cabinet was grotesque and improper. The remains should be properly buried in a churchyard in a marked grave with Christian dignity. He ordered the skull removed from the house immediately. The steward tried to protest. There were stories, he said. The house had been troubled before the head was brought back. There had been screaming, disturbances. Bringing the head had restored peace. William would not listen. He was master of Burton Agnes now, and he would not have body parts stored in his home like relics of a Catholic saint. The skull would be buried, and that would be the end of it. He instructed 2 of his new servants, men who knew nothing of the house's history and cared nothing for Yorkshire superstitions, to take the skull and inter it in the garden, deep enough that animals would not disturb it. They wrapped it in fresh cloth, carried it outside and buried it near the south wall where roses grew in summer. They marked the spot with a small stone. Then they returned to the house, washed their hands, and considered the matter closed. William congratulated himself on bringing reason and proper practice to Burton Agnes Hall. That night he and his family retired to their beds, confident in their mastery of the situation. And that night, the screaming began again. Chapter 6. The Servant's Terror. The sound was worse than anything the old servants remembered. It started near midnight. A low moan that built rapidly to a shriek of such intensity that it seemed to vibrate in the bones of every person in the house. William's children woke crying. His wife clutched his arm in terror. The servants rushed from their rooms in various states of undress, some screaming themselves, some praying aloud, all of them frightened beyond reason. The sound came from everywhere, from the walls, from the floors, from the very air itself. It was a woman's voice, unmistakably, but distorted by rage and grief into something barely human. It rose and fell, each cycle seeming to crescendo impossibly higher than the last. William, to his credit, tried to remain calm. He insisted it must be wind in the chimneys, some acoustic peculiarity of the old house, but even as he said it, he knew it was not true. No wind made a sound like that. The screaming continued for an hour. When it finally stopped, the silence was shattered immediately by crashes throughout the house. In the morning, they found destruction on every floor. Furniture overturned, pictures thrown from walls, crockery smashed, windows opened despite having been latched. In William's own bedchamber, every piece of clothing had been pulled from the wardrobe and torn to shreds. In the nursery, the children's toys had been gathered in a pile and broken systematically, each one crushed or snapped. In the long gallery, the cabinet where the skull had rested stood open, its doors hanging from broken hinges. And on the table beside it, scratched into the wood as if by fingernails, were words. "Bring me home, bring me home, bring me home." Over and over, covering the entire surface of the table, the same words repeated in a frantic scrawl. William stared at the words for a long time. Then he went downstairs and ordered the servants to dig up the skull. They did so with alacrity, grateful to be doing something, anything, that might end the horror. The skull was retrieved from the garden, still wrapped in its cloth, and brought back inside. William himself carried it up to the long gallery, placed it in the damaged cabinet and closed the doors as best he could. Then he stood for a moment, breathing hard, trying to understand what was happening. He was an educated man, a graduate of Cambridge, a reader of natural philosophy. He did not believe in ghosts or spirits or the power of dead bones, and yet he could not deny what he had witnessed. Something in this house wanted that skull to remain, something would not let it be taken away. That night was quiet, and the night after. William's wife begged him to leave Burton Agnes, to sell it, or lease it, or simply abandon it, to take the family back to Lincolnshire where they would be safe. But William's pride would not permit it. This was his inheritance, his estate, his responsibility. He would not be driven out by superstition and coincidence. There had to be a rational explanation. Perhaps the old servants were playing tricks, trying to frighten the new master into maintaining their old ways. Perhaps there was a conspiracy of some kind, designed to maintain control over the household. He began to watch the servants carefully, looking for signs of deception or collusion. He found nothing. The servants were as terrified as his family. Some of them were already talking about leaving despite having nowhere else to go. Weeks passed. The skull remained in the long gallery, and the house remained peaceful. William gradually relaxed his vigilance. Perhaps the crisis was over. Perhaps whatever strange forces had been at work had exhausted themselves. Life at Burton Agnes Hall returned to something approaching normalcy. The children played in the gardens. William attended to estate business. His wife began to make plans for hosting guests, for establishing themselves in Yorkshire society. Summer came, warm and green. The roses bloomed near the south wall, over the spot where the skull had been briefly buried. Everything seemed well. Then, in August, a new maid arrived from Bridlington. a young woman named Susan Carr who knew nothing of the house's history and cared nothing for local superstitions. Susan was assigned to clean the upper floors, including the long gallery. She was a diligent worker, thorough and efficient, the kind of servant who took pride in maintaining high standards. One morning, while dusting the cabinet that held the skull, she noticed a smell. Something was rotting, she thought. Perhaps a dead mouse in the walls, or some forgotten food. She opened the cabinet doors to check if the source was inside. She saw the skull. At first, she did not recognize it for what it was. The bone was old and yellowed, the jaw detached, lying separately from the cranium. She thought it might be some kind of medical specimen, the sort of thing gentlemen sometimes collected. She picked it up, meaning to take it to William and ask where it should properly be stored. The moment her fingers touched the bone, every door in the house slammed simultaneously. The sound was like thunder, a rolling boom that echoed through every corridor and chamber. Susan dropped the skull, which clattered onto the floor, the jaw breaking into several pieces. She stumbled backward, her heart racing. Then the screaming started, louder than before, more terrible than anything previously heard at Burton Agnes Hall. It seemed to come not from one voice, but from many, a chorus of anguish and rage that filled the air like smoke. Susan ran from the long gallery, down the stairs, sobbing, falling to her knees in the great hall. Other servants found her there, incoherent with terror. William came running. When they told him what had happened, he went white. He climbed the stairs to the long gallery. The skull lay on the floor, the pieces of jaw scattered around it, and the screaming continued on and on, as if it would never stop. He picked up the skull carefully, gathered the fragments of jaw, placed everything back in the cabinet and closed the doors. The screaming ceased instantly. The silence that followed was absolute, oppressive, heavy with unspoken threat. William stood alone in the long gallery, breathing hard, his hands shaking. He finally accepted what he should have accepted from the beginning. This house was not subject to natural laws. Something dwelled here, something connected to these bones, something that would not be denied or dismissed. He went downstairs and called the household together. From this day forward, he said, no one was to touch the cabinet in the long gallery. No one was to open it, clean it, or disturb it in any way. The skull would remain where it was, untouched and unmolested, for as long as Burton Agnes Hall stood. Anyone who disobeyed would be dismissed immediately. Did they understand? They understood. Susan Carr left Burton Agnes the next day, forfeiting her wages, walking the road to Bridlington without a backward glance. She told everyone she met about the haunted house, about the skull that could not be moved, about the screaming that came when it was disturbed. The story spread through the East Riding, acquiring embellishments and variations as it passed from mouth to mouth. Burton Agnes Hall became known as the most haunted house in Yorkshire. People avoided it. Servants became difficult to hire. William's wife grew thin and nervous, jumping at every sound. The children developed night terrors, but William remained, stubborn in his determination not to be driven from his inheritance. He lived with the skull in the long gallery, treated it with wary respect, and tried to pretend that everything was normal. Years later, after William's death, his son inherited Burton Agnes Hall. By then, the story of Anne's skull was well established as part of the house's fabric. The new master, more accepting of mysteries than his father had been, decided to be more accommodating to whatever spirit haunted the long gallery. He had the skull cleaned and placed in a proper reliquary, a small silver casket with a glass window, so it could be displayed with some dignity rather than hidden away in a damaged cabinet. The skull was moved to the great hall, placed on a shelf where visitors could see it, where Anne could preside over the life of the house, as perhaps she had always wanted. The arrangement seemed to satisfy whatever forces were at work. The house remained quiet. The skull stayed in its place. And gradually, over decades, it became simply a curiosity, a conversation piece, the famous Burton Agnes Skull that could not be removed without bringing disaster. But there were still those who tested it. Every few years someone would try. A sceptical guest, a new servant unaware of the history, a curious child. Someone would touch the skull, or move it, or carry it outside. And every time, without fail, the disturbances would begin. Doors slamming, objects thrown, the terrible screaming in the night. And every time, the skull would be returned to its place, and peace would be restored. It became a pattern, a cycle, a proof that some promises transcend death, that some bonds cannot be broken, and that Burton Agnes Hall belonged to Anne Griffith in a way that went deeper than ownership or inheritance. She had loved this house, she had asked to remain in it, and remain she would, whether the living approved or not. Dialogue Chapter 7. The Skull in the Wall. By the turn of the 18th century, Burton Agnes Hall had changed hands several times, passing through marriage and inheritance to families who knew the skull's story and treated it accordingly. The Griffith line had ended, their name absorbed into other lineages, but Anne's skull remained, a permanent fixture of the house, accorded a respect that bordered on reverence. The reliquary stood in the great hall, polished regularly by servants who approached the task with the solemnity of sacristans tending an altar. Visitors to Burton Agnes were always shown the skull, told the tale of its origin, warned against touching it. Some treated it as a Gothic amusement, a curiosity suitable for an age that was growing fond of ruins and ghosts and the romance of the past. Others felt genuine unease in its presence, sensing something in the bones that went beyond mere death, something that watched and waited and remembered. In 1715, the house passed to the Boynton family through marriage, and remained in their possession thereafter. The Boyntons were practical Yorkshire gentry, more interested in land management and agricultural improvement than in supernatural speculation. But they were not fools. They knew the skull's history. They knew what happened when it was disturbed. They left it in place and advised their children and grandchildren to do the same. For a century the arrangement held. The skull rested in its reliquary. The house was quiet. Anne Griffith's spirit, if spirit it was, seemed content. But in 1814 a new crisis arose. The master of Burton Agnes at that time was Sir Henry Boynton, a veteran of the Peninsular War, a man who had seen death in its most brutal forms, and who had little patience for superstition. He had inherited the house from his father and intended to modernise it, to bring Burton Agnes into the new century with improvements and renovations. Part of his plan involved relocating some of the older furniture and curiosities that he considered unsuitable for a gentleman's residence. The skull was on his list. It was morbid, he argued. It was unseemly. Whatever the story behind it, keeping human remains on display in the Great Hall was not consistent with the dignity and respectability he wished Burton Agnes to project. His wife agreed. His steward, who had served the family for 30 years and knew the old stories, urged caution. But Sir Henry was not a man who accepted caution easily. He had faced French cavalry charges. He would not be intimidated by bones. He ordered the skull buried properly in the churchyard at Harpham, in a marked grave, with a service conducted by the rector. It seemed the decent Christian thing to do. More than that, it seemed to bring closure to a story that had gone on far too long. On a grey March morning, Sir Henry himself carried the reliquary out to the waiting cart. The steward and several older servants watched from the doorway, their faces grim. Sir Henry ignored their expressions. He rode alongside the cart to Harpham Church, where Reverend John Marshall was waiting. The grave had been dug in the northeast corner of the churchyard, under an elm tree. The skull was removed from its reliquary and placed in a simple wooden box. Marshall read the burial service, abbreviated and awkward. For how did one conduct a burial service for a head when the body had been buried 200 years before? Sir Henry listened with his head bowed, feeling that he was finally doing right by his distant ancestor, giving her the rest she should have had from the beginning. The box was lowered into the ground. Earth was shovelled over it. A stone was placed to mark the spot, inscribed simply with Anne's name and dates. It was done. Sir Henry returned to Burton Agnes Hall satisfied that he had resolved a long-standing problem with appropriate dignity. That night, the house erupted. The disturbances were immediate and violent, worse than anything recorded in the family papers. Doors did not merely slam, they were torn from their hinges. Windows did not simply open, they shattered inward, glass exploding across floors and furniture. Fires went out in every hearth simultaneously, plunging the house into cold darkness. And the screaming when it came was so loud that people in the village of Burton Agnes, half a mile away, heard it and wondered what terrible thing was happening at the hall. Sir Henry's wife fled to her bedchamber and locked the door. His children huddled together in the nursery, too frightened to cry. The servants gathered in the kitchen, some praying, some weeping, all of them knowing what this meant. Sir Henry stood alone in the great hall, his jaw set, his fists clenched, refusing to believe that bones could do this, that the dead could impose their will upon the living. The disturbances continued for 3 days and nights without pause. No one could sleep, no one could eat. The house became uninhabitable, filled with the sound of destruction and the terrible screaming that echoed through every room. On the 4th day, Sir Henry broke. He rode to Harpham Church, dug up the wooden box himself without bothering to inform the rector, and brought the skull back to Burton Agnes Hall. The moment he carried it back through the door, everything stopped. The silence was sudden and complete. The servants emerged from their hiding places. Sir Henry's family came downstairs. They looked at the skull, at the yellowed bone in its broken reliquary, and they understood that they had lost. This was Anne's house. It had always been Anne's house, and it would remain Anne's house until Burton Agnes Hall itself crumbled to dust. But Sir Henry, though defeated, was also determined not to repeat this experience. If the skull could not be removed from the house, then it would be secured in a way that prevented future masters from making the same mistake. He consulted with the family steward and with the master mason, who was overseeing renovations to the south wing. A plan was developed. They would build the skull into the walls of the house itself, sealing it in stone and mortar, making it a permanent and immovable part of Burton Agnes's structure. Anne wanted to stay. Then she would stay in the most literal way possible. She would become part of the fabric of the house she loved, incorporated into its bones as she had incorporated the house into her own being. The work was done in May of that year. A section of wall in the great hall was opened, revealing the cavity between the outer stone and the inner plaster. The skull was wrapped carefully in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture, placed in a small wooden box lined with lead, and set into the cavity. Then the wall was closed up again, plastered over, painted to match the surrounding surfaces. When the work was finished, there was no visible sign that anything had been done. The skull was invisible, hidden, but present, still in the house, still home. Sir Henry had the reliquary melted down and refused to speak of the matter again. The secret of the skull's location was known only to him, to the steward, and to the mason, and they agreed that it would remain secret, passed down only to future masters of Burton Agnes Hall, so that no one would be tempted to disturb it again. The years passed. The 19th century progressed through its industrial transformations, its wars and reforms, its slow evolution from the Georgian world into something resembling modernity. Burton Agnes Hall remained largely unchanged, a red brick Elizabethan manor standing isolated in the Yorkshire countryside, its past intact, its stones holding secrets. The Boynton family continued in residence, each generation learning the story of Anne Griffith, each master being told in private where the skull was hidden within the walls. The knowledge became a burden of inheritance, something passed down like silver or land, a responsibility that came with ownership of the house. There were times when the skull's presence made itself felt, even hidden as it was. Servants reported cold spots in the Great Hall, places where the air seemed unnaturally chill regardless of season. Guests sometimes commented on a feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes following them through certain rooms. Children born and raised at Burton Agnes often claimed to see a woman in old-fashioned dress walking the long gallery or standing at the windows, though she vanished when approached. These phenomena were accepted with the same equanimity that the Boynton family applied to everything else about their ancestral home. Burton Agnes was haunted. That was simply a fact, as much a fact as the house having 10 bedrooms or 3 acres of gardens. One lived with it, one did not disturb it, and one certainly did not try to remove it. In 1900, a fire broke out in the south wing, caused by a faulty chimney. The damage was extensive, requiring major reconstruction. During the work, labourers discovered the skull's hiding place when they demolished the damaged section of the Great Hall wall. The wooden box was intact, its contents preserved by the lead lining. The master of Burton Agnes at that time, Sir Francis Boynton, was faced with a decision. The wall had to be rebuilt. The skull had been exposed. What should be done? He consulted family papers, read accounts of previous attempts to move or bury the skull, and decided on the safest course. The skull would be sealed back into the rebuilt wall in a new location, known only to him and to the master builder overseeing the reconstruction. And it was done. The skull disappeared again into the fabric of Burton Agnes Hall, invisible but present. Anne Griffith watching over her beloved house from within its very stones. The 20th century brought its wars and upheavals, its technological revolutions, its complete transformation of English life. Burton Agnes Hall survived, protected now not only by the Boynton family, but by preservation societies and heritage organisations that recognised its architectural and historical significance. The house was open to the public in the 1950s, allowing visitors to walk through its rooms, admire its plasterwork and panelling, hear stories of its past. The tale of Anne's skull became part of the standard tour, told and retold to thousands of visitors. Some believed it, some dismissed it as legend. But those who spent time in the house, particularly those who worked there as guides or caretakers, often developed a conviction that something lingered in Burton Agnes, something connected to the past, something that was not quite ready to depart. They learned to respect it, to speak politely when alone in the empty rooms, to acknowledge the presence that seemed to move through the corridors, and they learned never, ever, to suggest removing anything from the house without very good reason. The skull's exact location within the walls became unclear over time. The knowledge was supposed to pass from master to master, but memories fade, records are lost, and eventually no one could say with certainty exactly where in the fabric of Burton Agnes Hall Anne Griffith's skull rested. It was somewhere in the Great Hall wall, that much was certain. But where? The wall was thick, the house was large, and no one was willing to conduct a destructive search. So the skull remained hidden, its position unknown, its presence undoubted. Anne had gotten what she wanted in the end. She had stayed at Burton Agnes Hall. She had become part of it in the most literal sense, and she would remain part of it for as long as the house stood, a guardian spirit, a reminder that some loves and some loyalties outlast death itself, that some promises must be kept no matter how long the keeping takes. Chapter 8. The Modern Witnesses. The Second World War brought soldiers to Yorkshire. Burton Agnes Hall, like many great houses of England, was requisitioned for military use, its rooms converted to offices and barracks, its grounds used for training exercises. The Boynton family moved to the smaller estate buildings, and Burton Agnes became home to officers of the Royal Army Service Corps who knew nothing of its history and cared less. They were occupied with logistics and supply chains, with the grim mathematics of moving men and material across a continent at war. They had no time for ghost stories or old legends. The house was simply a building, useful for its size and location, nothing more. The commanding officer, a colonel named Arthur Denison, established his headquarters in the Great Hall. He set up his desk against the south wall, the very wall that contained Anne's skull, though he didn't know it. He worked there late into the night, reviewing reports, signing orders, planning movements. The war demanded constant attention. Sleep was a luxury he could rarely afford. He grew accustomed to the silence of the old house in the small hours, to the creaking of ancient timbers, to the way moonlight fell through the tall windows. He was not a fanciful man. He had seen too much death in the trenches of the previous war to be frightened by shadows or unsettled by atmosphere. Burton Agnes Hall was just a house. Old, certainly. Full of history, undoubtedly, but still just a house. Until the night he heard footsteps in the long gallery above his head. They were clear and distinct, the measured pace of someone walking back and forth, as if in thought or agitation. He looked at his watch. 3 a.m. No one should be awake. He climbed the stairs to investigate, his torch cutting a beam through the darkness. The long gallery stretched empty before him, its polished floor gleaming, its walls bare. The footsteps had stopped the moment he opened the door. He walked the length of the gallery, checking the rooms that opened off it, finding nothing. He returned to his desk, troubled but unable to articulate why. The next night the footsteps came again, and the night after that, always at the same hour, always the same measured pace. Colonel Dennison learned to ignore them. He told himself it was the house settling, or pipes contracting, or some other mundane explanation. He told no one else. An officer did not report hearing phantom footsteps. It would undermine confidence. Other soldiers stationed at Burton Agnes had their own experiences. A private swore he saw a woman in dark clothing standing at the window of the long gallery, visible from the grounds, though when he went inside to investigate, the gallery was empty. A sergeant reported that doors in the south wing would not stay closed, constantly drifting open no matter how firmly they were latched. A corporal claimed he heard crying in the middle of the night, a woman's voice, soft and desolate, though he could never locate its source. These reports filtered up to Colonel Dennison, who investigated them perfunctorily and found no explanations. He began to make discreet inquiries among the remaining Boynton staff, the few elderly servants who had stayed on to maintain the parts of the house not used by the military. That was when he first heard the story of Anne Griffith and her skull. The story troubled him more than he wanted to admit. He was a rational man, educated, experienced, not given to superstition. But he also knew that the world contained things that defied easy explanation, that the universe was stranger and more complex than materialism allowed. He had stood in no man's land under German artillery fire and felt presences around him, shapes that were not quite visible, movements at the edge of perception. He had seen men who should have died survive impossible wounds, and men who should have lived die from trivial injuries. The war had taught him that reality was more flexible than peacetime living suggested. So when he heard about the skull in the wall, about the hauntings that followed every attempt to remove it, he did not dismiss the tale out of hand. He simply filed it away as another mystery, another aspect of a world that contained too many mysteries for any one mind to comprehend. The war ended. The soldiers departed. Burton Agnes Hall was returned to the Boynton family, battered and worn but structurally intact. The family began the slow process of restoration, repairing damage, replacing furniture, returning the house to something approaching its pre-war condition. In 1951, they made the decision to open Burton Agnes to the public. The house's architectural significance, its Elizabethan features and fine plasterwork, merited preservation and appreciation. And the income from visitors would help maintain an estate that had become increasingly expensive to run in the post-war world. Guides were hired, rooms were prepared, information pamphlets were printed, and the story of Anne's skull became part of the official tour. The guides learned quickly that the skull was the detail visitors remembered most clearly. People might forget the date of construction or the name of the architect, but they remembered the story of the woman who was murdered, who haunted her beloved house, whose skull was sealed somewhere in the walls. Some visitors asked to see the skull, disappointed when told it was hidden and its exact location unknown. Some asked if the hauntings continued. The guides, instructed to be factual and matter-of-fact, would say that strange things were sometimes reported, that the house had an atmosphere that many people found unsettling, but that there was no definitive proof of supernatural activity. They said this even though many of the guides had their own experiences, their own stories of cold spots and unexplained sounds, of feeling watched in empty rooms and sensing presences that disappeared when directly confronted. Margaret Fletcher worked as a guide at Burton Agnes Hall from 1952 to 1968. She was a local woman, born in the village, who had heard stories about the house all her life but had never visited until she took the job. She was sceptical of ghost stories, viewing them as entertainment rather than reality. Her skepticism lasted approximately 3 weeks. One afternoon, while conducting a tour through the long gallery, she distinctly felt someone walk past her, close enough that she felt the displacement of air, though no one was visible. She stopped mid-sentence, staring at the empty space beside her. The tourist looked at her curiously. She recovered and continued the tour, but the experience shook her. After that, she paid closer attention to what she felt in different parts of the house. The great hall always felt occupied, even when empty. The long gallery felt melancholy. The state rooms felt neutral, pleasant. But the great hall felt like someone was always present, watching, attending. Margaret was not the only guide who felt this. Over the years, as staff came and went, a consensus emerged among those who spent significant time at Burton Agnes. The house was not empty. Something remained. Something that was not hostile but was definitely present. Something that seemed particularly concentrated around the great hall and the long gallery. Guides learned to speak respectfully when alone, to announce themselves when entering empty rooms, to avoid making disparaging comments about the house or its history. It was not that anything terrible would happen if they were disrespectful, more that it felt wrong, like being rude to a host in their own home. Burton Agnes Hall was Anne's house. The living were guests, and guests should mind their manners. In 1965, a film crew came to Burton Agnes to shoot a documentary about historic houses of Yorkshire. They set up their equipment in the Great Hall, positioning lights and cameras, planning their shots. The director, a London man named Peter Ashworth, was amused by the skull story and asked the guides to tell it on camera, thinking it would add colour to the documentary. The filming went smoothly until late afternoon. They were shooting cutaway footage, empty rooms with narration to be added later. The camera was set up on a tripod in the long gallery, running unattended while the crew took a break. When they reviewed the footage later, they found something unexpected. For approximately 30 seconds in the middle of the shot, a shadow moved across the gallery, clearly visible on film though no one had been in the room at the time. The shadow had a human shape, female, walking slowly from one end of the gallery to the other. Then it vanished. Ashworth was disturbed by the footage. He considered it must be a technical fault, a flaw in the film stock or processing. But the cameraman, who had worked in film for 20 years, said he had never seen a technical fault that looked like that. The shadow had depth and substance. It moved with purpose. It looked like someone walking, filmed through multiple exposures, translucent but definite. They showed the footage to the Burton Agnes guides, who watched in silence. Then one of them, an older woman who had worked at the house for a decade, said quietly that they should not have filmed without asking permission. Ashworth asked what she meant. She said that the house should be treated with respect, that they should have announced what they were doing, that Anne did not like strangers taking liberties. Ashworth, despite himself, apologised to the empty room. They finished their filming without further incident. The shadow footage was included in the documentary, where it generated considerable interest and scepticism in equal measure. The 1970s brought paranormal investigators. Burton Agnes Hall, by then well known in ghost hunting circles, became a popular destination for people with tape recorders and electromagnetic field detectors with theories about residual energy and psychic impressions. The Boynton family granted limited access, allowing serious researchers to conduct investigations while keeping out sensationalists and publicity seekers. Most of the investigations produced ambiguous results, anomalous readings on equipment that might indicate something unusual or might indicate faulty equipment, recordings that contained sounds that could be interpreted as voices or as audio artifacts. Nothing definitive, nothing that would convince a skeptic. But the investigators invariably left Burton Agnes Hall with the same impression that the guides and long-term visitors reported. The house felt occupied. Something was there, whether it was Anne Griffith's spirit, or some other phenomenon, or simply the accumulated atmosphere of centuries, no one could say with certainty. But the presence was undeniable to those who were sensitive to such things. In 1983, a television show about haunted houses sent a team to Burton Agnes. They brought mediums and psychics, people who claimed to be able to sense spirits and communicate with the dead. One of the mediums, a woman named Elizabeth Harding, walked through the house with her eyes closed, letting her hands trail along the walls. When she reached the Great Hall, she stopped at the south wall, placed both palms flat against the plaster, and said very clearly, "She is here. She is in this wall. She is watching us. She wants us to know that she is content, that she is home, that she will always be here." The television crew recorded this, dramatic and compelling. Later, when they researched the story, they learned that Elizabeth Harding could not possibly have known about the skull's location through normal means. The exact spot where the skull was sealed had been lost to family memory decades earlier, and yet she had gone directly to the south wall of the Great Hall, the wall where the skull had last been placed in 1900. Coincidence, perhaps, or perhaps something more. The stories accumulated. Decade after decade, Burton Agnes Hall collected accounts of experiences, sightings, feelings, impressions, not constant hauntings, not violent or terrifying phenomena, but a steady accumulation of small evidences that the house remembered its mistress, that Anne Griffith remained in some form, watching over the place she had loved more than life itself. Visitors would report seeing a woman in dark clothing reflected in windows, though no such woman was in the room. Staff would find doors open that they had closed, lights on in empty rooms. Once, in 1991, a group of schoolchildren on a tour all claimed to smell roses in the Great Hall in the middle of winter, a scent strong and sweet that lasted for several minutes then vanished completely. The guides could offer no explanation. There were no flowers in the house, no potpourri, no air fresheners, just the scent of roses, ephemeral and inexplicable. The house entered the 21st century largely unchanged. New technologies came and went: electric lighting, central heating, computer systems for managing admissions and accounts. But the essential character of Burton Agnes Hall remained fixed in 1620, the year Anne died, the year her story became inseparable from the house's story. The tourists still came, drawn by the architecture and the ghost story in equal measure. The guide still told the tale of the murdered woman and her skull, and occasionally, very occasionally, something would happen that reminded everyone that Burton Agnes Hall was not merely a museum, not merely a historic property, but a living place where past and present existed simultaneously, where the boundary between then and now was thinner than usual, where a woman who had died 4 centuries earlier maintained her watch. Chapter 9. The Question That Remains. The 21st century brought new questions to old mysteries. The internet age transformed how stories were shared and examined, how evidence was gathered and debated. Burton Agnes Hall found itself discussed on forums and websites, analysed by amateur investigators and professional skeptics, photographed and filmed by countless visitors who posted their images online. The skull story was retold in blogs and podcasts, in documentary series and paranormal television shows. Some sought to debunk it as legend and superstition. Others sought to prove it as genuine supernatural phenomenon. Most simply found it compelling, a story that captured imagination because it touched on fundamental questions about death and love and the persistence of consciousness beyond the grave. In 2003, the Preservation Trust commissioned a comprehensive survey of Burton Agnes Hall's structure, using modern techniques including ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging. The purpose was practical, to assess the condition of the walls, to locate any hidden voids or weaknesses, to plan for necessary repairs and maintenance. But everyone involved knew that the survey might also locate Anne's skull. The question became whether to actively search for it, or to simply record what the equipment revealed without specifically trying to find the hidden remains. After much discussion, the Trust decided on the latter approach. They would conduct the survey for its intended purpose. If the skull's location was revealed in the process, so be it. But they would not conduct a deliberate search. Anne had been hidden with purpose. That purpose should be respected. The survey was conducted over several weeks. The equipment operators moved through the house systematically, recording data, creating three-dimensional maps of wall cavities and structural elements. In the Great Hall, the south wall showed several anomalies, spaces within the thick stone and plaster where objects or voids existed. One cavity, approximately 18 inches square and located 4 feet above the floor, contained what the imaging suggested was a small box or container, surrounded by dense material, possibly lead. The surveyors marked its location on their diagrams and moved on. They did not open the wall. They did not investigate further. The Trust received the survey results and filed them with the house's other historical documents. The skull's probable location was now known, precisely documented with modern technology. But nothing was done with that knowledge. The wall remained intact. Anne remained undisturbed. Some argued this was a missed opportunity, that the skull should be recovered and given proper scientific examination. Forensic techniques in the early 21st century could reveal information impossible to determine in earlier eras. DNA analysis could confirm identity, trace family lineages. Examination of the bone could provide details about Anne's health, her diet, the exact nature of her injury. The skull could become a source of genuine historical knowledge rather than a legend sealed in a wall. But others countered that the skull's power lay precisely in its hiddenness, in the mystery that surrounded it. To remove it, to subject it to clinical examination, would be to reduce Anne Griffith to data points and test results. The story would be diminished. The house would lose something essential, and most importantly, every previous attempt to remove the skull had resulted in disturbances. Why test that again? Why risk disrupting the peace that had held for over a century? The debate was resolved by doing nothing. Burton Agnes Hall continued as it always had, offering tours, hosting events, serving as a venue for weddings and private functions. The skull remained in the wall. The guides continued to tell the story, now with the added detail that modern imaging had likely located the skull, but that it had been deliberately left in place out of respect for Anne's wishes. Some visitors found this decision admirable. Others found it frustrating, a capitulation to superstition. But the decision held. The Trust recognised that Burton Agnes Hall's value lay not merely in its architecture but in its stories, in the layers of human experience that had accumulated within its walls. Anne's story was part of that accumulation. To extract the skull would be to extract a piece of the house's soul. As the years of the new century progressed, a different kind of attention focused on Burton Agnes. Academic historians, moving beyond their discipline's long skepticism of paranormal claims, began to examine ghost stories as cultural phenomena worthy of serious study. Burton Agnes, with its well-documented history and its persistent hauntings, became a case study in how folklore and memory functioned, how stories evolved and maintained themselves across generations. Researchers came not to prove or disprove the hauntings, but to understand why this particular story had such enduring power, what it revealed about human relationships with death and with place. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a folklorist from the University of Leeds, spent 3 months at Burton Agnes in 2015, conducting extensive interviews with guides, staff and regular visitors. Her resulting paper, published in the Journal of British Folklore Studies, argued that the Burton Agnes Skull functioned as a physical anchor for collective memory, a focal point around which community identity and historical consciousness could organise themselves. The skull, whether viewed as genuinely supernatural or as purely symbolic, served a social purpose. It connected present inhabitants and visitors to the past in a tangible way. It provided continuity. It suggested that individual human lives, even lives ended by violence and tragedy, could maintain significance across centuries. The story endured because it met deep psychological needs for permanence, for justice, for the possibility that love and loyalty might transcend mortality. Mitchell's work sparked further academic interest. Other researchers examined similar cases in British folklore, comparing Burton Agnes to other reportedly haunted houses, looking for patterns and commonalities. What emerged from this scholarship was a recognition that hauntings, whether real or imagined, served as a form of collective memory work. Communities used ghost stories to preserve and transmit historical knowledge, to maintain connections with past generations, to create a sense of continuity in a rapidly changing world. Burton Agnes Hall's hauntings kept Anne Griffith's story alive. They ensured that a woman who might otherwise have been forgotten, a spinster who never married, who held no public office, who wrote no books, who did nothing that would normally merit historical attention, remained known and remembered 400 years after her death. This scholarly attention did not diminish the experiential aspects of Burton Agnes. If anything, it added another layer to the house's significance. Visitors now came not only for the architecture and the ghost story, but also to witness how a place could hold memory, how the past could remain present. The guides found that people's reactions to Burton Agnes depended less on whether they believed in ghosts than on their openness to ambiguity, their comfort with uncertainty. Those who needed definitive answers, proof or disproof, fact or fiction, often left dissatisfied. But those who could accept mystery, who could live with not knowing, found Burton Agnes deeply compelling. The house invited contemplation rather than conclusion. It posed questions rather than offering answers. In 2019, a group of scientists from the University of York conducted a study on atmospheric and environmental factors that might contribute to reported hauntings. They brought equipment to measure electromagnetic fields, infrasound, air pressure, temperature variations, all the physical phenomena that some researchers believed could trigger sensations that people interpreted as ghostly presence. They spent a week at Burton Agnes, taking readings throughout the house at different times of day and night. Their findings were complex and ambiguous. The Great Hall did show slightly unusual electromagnetic readings, particularly near the south wall, though this could be explained by old wiring or metal elements in the structure. Infrasound levels were occasionally elevated, which could theoretically induce feelings of unease or the sense of being watched. But the correlation between these measurements and reported experiences was inconsistent. Sometimes people reported feeling presences in areas where all readings were normal. Sometimes the equipment showed anomalies in areas where people felt nothing unusual. The scientists' conclusion was cautious. Burton Agnes Hall exhibited some environmental factors that might contribute to subjective experiences of haunting, but these factors alone could not explain the consistency and specificity of reports across decades and centuries. Something more was happening, though what that something was remained unclear. The house's history, its atmosphere, its stories, and its physical characteristics combined to create an environment where unusual experiences were more likely. Whether those experiences originated in objective supernatural phenomena, in subjective psychological responses to environment and expectation, or in some combination of both. The mystery remained mysterious. Burton Agnes continued to resist easy categorization. This resistance to simple explanation seemed appropriate for a house built in the late Elizabethan period. an era that itself stood at the boundary between medieval worldviews and early modern rationalism, between a universe populated by spirits and a universe governed by natural laws. Anne Griffith had lived in that transitional moment, had known a world where the supernatural was taken for granted, where death did not necessarily end human agency, where the boundary between living and dead was more permeable than later ages would assume. Perhaps her story endured precisely because it carried forward something from that earlier worldview, something that more secular and materialist centuries had not entirely eliminated, something that still resonated with people who felt that reality contained more than what could be measured and quantified. Burton Agnes Hall in the 21st century remained what it had always been, a beautiful Elizabethan manor house with exceptional architectural features and rich historical significance. But it was also more than that. It was a place where history felt immediate rather than distant, where the past seemed to press against the present, where a woman who died in 1620 maintained some form of presence that visitors and staff continued to encounter. Whether Anne Griffith's consciousness truly persisted in some form, whether her skull genuinely possessed some property that caused disturbances when moved, whether the hauntings were objectively real or collectively constructed, these questions remained open, and perhaps they needed to remain open. Perhaps the power of Burton Agnes Hall lay precisely in its refusal to be fully explained, its insistence that some mysteries should remain mysterious, that some questions should remain unanswered. Chapter 10. The Watcher. Still night falls over Burton Agnes Hall as it has fallen for more than 4 centuries. The winter darkness settling early across the Yorkshire fields, the lights of the village distant and faint. The house stands as it always has, red brick and white stone solid against the cold, windows reflecting the last pale gleam of sunset. Inside, the rooms are quiet. The tourists have departed. The staff have locked the doors and gone to their homes. The house is empty of the living, left to itself and to whatever else might dwell within its walls. In the great hall, shadows gather in the corners beyond the reach of security lights. The plasterwork that Anne watched being installed in her youth still adorns the ceiling, its fruits and flowers and classical figures unchanged, only darkened by centuries of candle smoke and time. The oak panelling glows dully. The stone floor, worn smooth by countless footsteps, reflects nothing. And in the south wall, hidden behind plaster and paint, sealed in its lead-lined box wrapped in oiled cloth, Anne Griffith's skull rests as it has rested for more than a century, undisturbed, secret, present. The bone is yellowed now, ancient, the wound that killed her still visible as a depression in the left side of the cranium. If it could be removed and examined, if it could speak through modern forensic science, it might reveal details of her final moments, might provide data about diet and health and the violence that ended her life. But it will not be removed. The house has made that clear across 400 years. Anne stays. That was the promise. That was the bargain struck in a moment of dying desperation and kept through centuries of consequence. Does consciousness persist? Does Anne Griffith, in some form recognisable as herself, continue within Burton Agnes Hall? The question has been asked by philosophers and theologians, by scientists and spiritualists, by everyone who has heard the story and wondered what it means. There are no definitive answers. There are only the accumulated experiences of generations, the servants who heard screaming when the skull was removed, the soldiers who encountered footsteps and shadows, the guides who felt watched in empty rooms, the visitors who sensed something present that they could not name. Evidence, perhaps, or perhaps only the power of suggestion, the human mind's tendency to find patterns and presences in ambiguity. The question remains open. What is not in question is that Burton Agnes Hall remembers. Buildings hold memory in ways we do not fully understand. They absorb the lives lived within them, the emotions felt in their rooms, the events that unfold beneath their roofs. A house where someone has loved deeply carries that love in its fabric. A house where someone has died violently carries that violence. Burton Agnes carries both: Anne's deep love for the place she considered home, and the brutal violence that ended her life and nearly separated her from it. The combination created something powerful, something that could not be easily dismissed or forgotten. The house became a testament to the strength of attachment, to the possibility that love for a place could be strong enough to persist beyond death, to impose itself on the living, to reshape the physical world according to its will. Through all the centuries of changing ownership, through all the alterations and restorations, through wars and peace, through the complete transformation of English society from Tudor to modern, Burton Agnes Hall has maintained its essential character. It is Anne's house. It was built during her lifetime. She watched every stone placed. She knew every room. She loved it with an intensity that most people never feel for anything. And when she died, that love did not die with her. Whether through supernatural persistence or through the power of story to shape perception, whether through objective haunting or collective belief, Anne remained. The house recognized her claim. The living learned to respect it. The story has become part of Yorkshire folklore, told and retold, embellished and examined, passed down through generations. Children growing up in the East Riding hear about the Burton Agnes Skull before they are old enough to understand its full implications. The story becomes part of how they understand their local geography, part of the landscape of memory and meaning that makes a place home. Tourists come from distant countries to hear the tale, to walk through the rooms, to stand in the Great Hall and try to sense whatever presence might linger there. Some feel nothing. Some feel everything. The house does not perform on demand. It offers no guarantees. It simply is what it is. A place where the boundaries between past and present seem thinner than usual, where history feels immediate, where one woman's love for her home persists across centuries. As night deepens, the house settles into itself. The central heating system clicks and hums. Old timbers creak as they contract in the cold. These are normal sounds, explicable sounds, the sounds any old building makes. But sometimes, between these ordinary sounds, there are others. Footsteps that have no source. Doors that open, though no hand touches them. The sense of someone moving through corridors, climbing stairs, standing at windows to look out over the darkened gardens. The staff, arriving in the morning, sometimes find things slightly rearranged. A chair moved, a curtain drawn that was left open. Small changes that might be explained by settling, or by overnight cleaning crews, or by any number of mundane causes. But the staff know. They have worked at Burton Agnes long enough to recognise the pattern. Anne is making her rounds. Anne is checking on her house. Anne is maintaining her eternal vigil. In the long gallery, moonlight falls through the tall windows in pale bars across the polished floor. This was Anne's favourite room, the space where she walked and thought and dreamed. If her spirit walks anywhere in Burton Agnes Hall, it walks here. The guides sometimes speak of feeling her most strongly in this space, of sensing a presence that is not hostile or frightening but melancholic, watchful, eternally patient. A woman waiting for something that will never come, or perhaps a woman who has already received what she wanted and requires nothing more. She is home. She is where she chose to be. The violence that killed her could not prevent it. The church that tried to bury her elsewhere could not prevent it. The skepticism of rational ages could not prevent it. She is home, and she will remain home for as long as Burton Agnes Hall stands. What happens when buildings fall, when time and decay finally claim the last stone, when the roof caves in and the walls crumble and the earth reclaims what was taken from it? Will Anne's skull finally rest then? Will whatever force keeps her present finally release? Or will the story persist even without the physical structure to anchor it, becoming pure legend, pure folklore, carried forward in words alone? These questions have no answers yet. Burton Agnes Hall stands solid, protected protected by preservation orders and maintained by careful stewardship. It may stand another 400 years. It may stand longer. And as long as it stands, Anne will be there, watching over the house she loved, keeping the promise she made to herself in the last moments of consciousness, refusing to be separated from the place that gave her identity and purpose. The night is very quiet now. The village sleeps, the countryside sleeps. The house, if houses can be said to sleep, rests in the darkness, but not entirely dormant, never entirely empty. Somewhere in the fabric of Burton Agnes Hall, in the stones and timbers, in the plaster and paint, in the very air that fills its rooms, Anne Griffith persists. Not as a woman of flesh and blood, not as she was in life, but as something else. Memory made manifest, love given form, will impressed upon matter. She is the watcher still. She is the guardian of this place. She is the proof, if proof is needed, that some bonds cannot be broken by death, that some loves endure beyond mortality, that some promises once made must be kept forever. The candle burned low, the chamber fell silent, and history once again turned the page in the dark. But this page, this story, this woman will not fade. Burton Agnes Hall remembers. The skull in the wall remains. Anne Griffith keeps her vigil, and the house that she loved more than life itself continues to stand, testimony to the power of attachment, monument to persistence, home to a spirit that will not depart. The living come and go, their lives brief flickers against the long darkness of time. But Anne stays, Anne watches, Anne waits. In the house she refused to leave, in the walls that hold her bones, in the rooms that knew her footsteps she remains. The watcher still, the guardian eternal, the mistress of Burton Agnes Hall, now and always, until time itself should end. Good night, wherever you are. May your rest be peaceful, and may you find, in your own way, a home that holds you as Burton Agnes holds Anne, with loyalty, with memory, and with love that transcends the grave.